You may be seated. Thank you for joining with us today, both online. Thank you for logging on and watching our service today. We're in a series called God's Not Done Yet. And it's a series that basically is talking about the fact that God has begun a good work in us. We get this out of Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, kind of the theme verse. The God Paul says he's confident of this, that the God who began a good work in you will be faithful, will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And that brings a lot of hope and encouragement to us because we know God's not done. He is at work, He's moving, He's active, and He's involved in our lives. And that's a great thing. Anyone see the Kentucky Derby last weekend? It was quite a race. If you haven't seen it, you might want to go onto YouTube and watch it. It was they call it one of the great ones. It's been running 148 years. But this one was rather significant because the last place horse, the lowest odds, 80-1 odds, actually pulled it off and won. Came from the back and right at the end moved into the beginning, and it was surprised everybody. And I get there's something about it, when you read the story and it's exciting. The lowest odds, the last one to, and even you didn't even know he was going to be in the race till the day before, and the owner who had lost had a big fire and was considering getting out of horse racing not long, a few years before, and then stuck with it, and then to go from obscurity, never had a horse that ran and won, and to go to fame is just. It's just an amazing story. We love those underdog stories, right? Of people who go from relative obscurity to this position of prominence. And it's interesting when we think about it because Jesus did the exact opposite. Jesus was the Son of God, the Messiah, the Lord of all, and He went from the position of power into a place of absolute humility, being born without even a home to live in. And to grow up in obscurity. And we call this demotion a place of humility. It's something that God seems to value, something that God seems to think is a very powerful thing. And the one character quality that Jesus used, describes Himself, like the only time in Jesus' words where He describes a character, His own characteristics, the one thing that He describes Himself as, the one characteristic that He says, this is me? It's in Matthew 11, and this is what He says. He says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am," and here it is, "I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls." In a busy, burned-out world, these are very powerful words, aren't they? And it's how Jesus self-describes Himself, the character that He sees as part of His life. I am gentle and humble in heart. He grew up submitting to His parents. Think of it, the King of Kings. He grew up submitting to His parents. He came, He says, to seek and to serve people. The great God, the great Creator, walked among us, and His mission, His goal was to serve, to humble Himself and serve. He would interact with people, and He'd ask them questions. He'd make them feel valued. He was in a position of learning. And it just seemed to, when you look at the life of Jesus, the humility is the one thing that really stands out. Not only does He describe Himself that way, but He lived it. It was foundational. So the first thing I want to say is this, is that humility is foundational to developing overall character. It really is a key thing. In fact, when a person takes on this idea of humility, they become you posture yourself in a place to learn, to become teachable, to listen. You say, like, I'm not too big, for my boots. My head is not too big to learn from you, and I'm willing to humble myself. And that's the position, that's the posture that really becomes the foundation upon which all of the other characteristics can grow out of. We can learn and develop when we assume this position of humility. It really is foundational. When we talked a couple weeks ago about abiding and the idea of remaining connected to the vine, He said, if we really want to produce fruit, if we want to see character growing in our lives, we need to, we really need to see, we need to get back to the basics of developing humility and just connecting and staying close to Jesus. These are some of the foundational things. And if we get these down, out of those will grow the other characteristics. So my plan going into this morning was simply to look at the life of Jesus and talk about humility. And then I saw this verse and I read it, and it always makes me chuckle when I read it. And I'll show it to you. It's in Numbers chapter 12. It says this: "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." And the reason it kind of makes me smile when I read it is because it was written in the book of Numbers, which would be something like, who wrote the book of Numbers? Well, it was Moses. But most believe that this was an insert by a scribe or someone, and thus the brackets around it that was just sort of put in. It helps to set up and understand what Moses was writing. That helps us to understand why he acted the way he did, because he was a very humble person in the view of the people who lived in that day. He was a powerful leader. He was leading the people. They looked to him for leadership, and yet he exhibited a high degree of humility. But he didn't start this way. In fact, when I thought about it, I realized that he had some lessons to learn. Remember, he was raised in Pharaoh's court. He was treated like royalty, taken into the royal family in Pharaoh's home, and he had a lot going for him. And then when growing up, he felt like God was calling him to deliver his people, because he was of Jewish descent, and the Jews had been turned into slaves, and they were being mistreated in Egypt. And he felt God leading him to be this deliverer. Maybe some suggested that he take that role on too. And so he steps out. He actually murders an Egyptian who he sees beating on a fellow Jew. Well, that doesn't go over very well, and he has to flee the country. And he ends up out in the wilderness for 40 years. It's a long time. But I think this was a key part of his development. God needed him to step down from his position of royalty and his position of entitlement and his position where I can leverage my strength and my resources to pull this off. He had to move from that to a place where I have nothing. And he goes out into the wilderness, he becomes a shepherd, and he has no ability at that point to be a deliverer. Well, so God worked on him during that time. And then the second thing that happened is that God shows up to talk to him, and he does it in a very unusual way. There's this burning bush, which was, I believe, mostly just an attention getter, because it caused Moses to go over and check it out. And he looks at the bush, and it's not being consumed, it's not burning up, and God speaks to him in that moment, telling him, first of all, to take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. It's like, okay, I'm in the presence of greatness. And so he removes his sandals and he listens to God. And God starts to speak to him, and he first of all says in chapter 3, verse 9, we'll pick it up. God says, "And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses, you're the one. I want you to go. I want you to lead my people out of Egypt. I've seen their suffering. I've seen their pain. Enough's enough. Now's the time. But Moses pushes back. He says to God in verse 11, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" This is the first of his 5 excuses that he brings before God. 5 times he questions this, saying, God, first of all, he says, who am I? I am nothing. I have no influence. I have no power. I have no way to pull this off. And God responds to the next verse, verse 12, and says, I will be with you. I will be with you. Moses, what you need to understand is you need to get your eyes off of you and your situation and what you have and realize that when I am with you, that changes everything. Focus on me. You know, when Moses said, "Who am I?" it wasn't necessarily all a bad thing. I'm wondering if God said, "Okay, sounds like Moses, you're ready. You realize you can't do this in your own strength." So maybe an excuse is a bad way of putting this first one, because he really is coming from a position of humility. I don't have anything to pull this off. But God responds and reminds us that it's not about us. And the way I worded it is this. One person said, humble people don't think less of themselves. They think of themselves less. And I thought, that's what Moses needed to do. He needed to get his eyes off of, what I have and who I am, and focus more on what God is calling him to do and the fact that God is with him. It's not so much about me, not so much about you. We need to focus our attention on God and what he's asking us to do. Anyway, go on in the story. In verse 13, it says, Moses says to God, it says, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, okay, the God of your fathers has sent me to you." And they ask, "Well, what is his name?" Then what shall I tell them? Like, what do I call you? What's your name? And he's almost using this like, I don't know if I can go because who sent me? And God says in verse 14, God says to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent you." This idea of God using just a present active verb, "I am," of his existence. I exist. Is the sense that he's saying, I am who I am. I exist and I have always existed. I am it's almost like I'm outside of time. I'm ever present. And so the first two things we see about God in this is, first of all, God is with Moses. And it's not just any God, it's the ever-present one who's always there, who's with us. Ever present. He was there at the beginning. He's there. He'll be there at the end. He is the I am, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I am. The all-knowing God. And putting these, so another point just about humility that I think it would be good for us to pick up on this, and this is the third thing I want to say. It's not the strength of the foe before me, but it's the power of the one behind me. It's not just the task in front of me. It's just, I can't do that. It's like we've got to take our focus off that and recognize who it is that's calling us, who's behind us, who's resourcing us. I always love there's an ad made about this, and also an old movie around this concept of a baby bear that's down at the river trying to catch, trying his hand at fishing, and there's this wildcat sneaking up, and it's getting closer and closer to the baby bear, and the baby bear finally notices and stands up and sort of tries to imitate what he's seen his mom do, and kind of tries to scare the cat away, and stands up on its legs, and all of a sudden the wildcat, cougar or whatever, turns and slinks away. And the baby bear thinks, wow, I'm pretty good. It worked. And then the camera pans out, and you see behind the baby bear that the mother had just come up and stood up, and was this massive bear standing behind the baby. And you realize, oh, okay, it's not the baby. It's the mama standing right behind him. And that image, that picture is a little bit what Moses was facing. Like, he felt like in his own strength he couldn't do this. But he had to remember that there was there was one who was behind him, who's with him, who's the great I am, and he will be there for him and walk behind him and give him what he needs. And so I think when we're thinking about, there's a place where you can almost take humility so far that you can feel like you can't do anything, but that becomes almost a false humility. We have to remember the one who's with us and the one who is behind us. Anyway, let's continue on. In chapter 4, it reads that Moses answered, well, what if they do not, this is his third excuse, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Like, how am I going to prove? I mean, they've been years as slaves. They've been crying out to you, and there's been nothing. Years of disappointment with God. Where are you, God? Why are you silent? Why aren't you doing something? And then I'm supposed to walk onto the scene and say, God's told me to come and, come with me out to Sinai. We're leaving Egypt. Like, why would they believe me? Why would they do that? And the Lord responds in verse 2. Then the Lord said to Moses, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. And the Lord said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. And he ran from it. He was afraid of it. He was fearful. Just like going to stand before Pharaoh was a fearful thing. Even that snake in front of him scared him. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out, took hold of the snake, and turned it back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that you may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. This is a sign. When you put that staff down, turns into a snake, and you pick it up again and becomes a staff, like that will be a sign. They'll know that you've been sent. You've been sent by me. But I thought about it, it's probably more than a sign. Because Moses had to reach down and he had to face his fear, didn't he? He ran from that snake, and now I would have a hard time doing that. Reaching down and grabbing a snake by the tail, and he had to face his fear. And I think God had him in training here too, that you have to face this fear of taking on Pharaoh. And as you go before him, remember, I'm with you. The great I am is with you. And now I've given you a sign. But he's not done. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. And so Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. The worst and scariest disease known to them back in that day. Leprosy. And then God says, now put it back in your cloak, he said. And so Moses put his hand in his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, if you do not believe, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. So he's given him now three signs: a staff, leprosy, and now the river being poured out. Interesting, the second sign, there was no fear mentioned in it, right? The first one, he was fearful of the snake. The second one, that'd be scary to pull your hand out and see it all leprous, but it doesn't say anything about fear. And then the third one would be fearful to the Egyptian people, because the Nile was their life. In fact, they believed it was a god. And to see it turn to blood would be a rather scary picture. Now, so God's given him these three signs. And it's something that Moses can't do on his own. I mean, he can't pull these off. And so God's teaching him about facing his fears, but he's also teaching him something else. He's teaching him, and humility really is about learning to depend on God. It's like, okay, I need to depend on you. We talked about this earlier. Curtis talked about this. And it's coming to a point where we say, God, I need you to see me through. I need you to help me with this. And God would say, like, lean on me. I want you to lean on me when you're not strong. And I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on, right? Because that's what God's like. He wants us to lean on Him. He wants us to learn to depend on Him. Humility is about learning to depend on God. And I think that's where God wanted him. He's facing his fears. He's learning to depend on God. He's realizing he's got power behind him. He's in a training. God is teaching him throughout this to be the leader he needs him to be. Moses, in the fourth excuse, because Moses got another question then. His fourth reason not to go, he says, Moses says, Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. I'm really not the person you want to get up there to stand in front of all these people. I talk too slow. Maybe he stuttered. He's just not a good person up there. And you can imagine the scene where it would happen, right? He's sort of picturing this in his head. That he would stand up in front of all the people, and he would be addressing them, and all the people would stand there with this awkward feeling like, ooh, he's not a very good speaker. And God would say, oh, I picked the wrong guy. Oh, I can't believe I should have looked into I should have read his resume. I should have checked this out ahead of time. I'm so surprised. That's not how God responds at all, is it? God says, I gave you your tongue. I know all about you. In fact, I think that's actually a good thing. Because again, you'll have to learn to depend on me. And as I reflected on this, I realized that humble people aren't afraid of their weaknesses. They're not afraid of their weaknesses. They recognize that God uses those weaknesses. Maybe instead of taking strengths tests, we do these different tests to evaluate how we're doing and what we should focus on because these are our strengths. And maybe we should be taking weaknesses tests. What are we not good at? Because typically that's where God wants to use us. Because when we understand our weaknesses, it's like God says, then you'll know where I can use you. It's in the midst of the weakness. I read an article by a guy named Chris Amadei. He was an atheist, and he explains how he changed his mind. In this article called, The People That Challenged My Atheism the Most Were Drug Addicts and Prostitutes. Interesting title. He writes this, I escaped my hometown, eventually receiving a PhD in physics. I then moved to Wall Street for 20 years, a life devoted to rational thought, a life devoted to numbers and clever arguments. And during that time, I counted myself an atheist and nodded in agreement as atheistic arguments swept out of the university and into the media, led by Richard Dawkins, who was my hero. I saw some of myself in him. Quick with arguments, uneasy with emotion, comfortable with logic. Able to look at any thought process or worldview and expose its inconsistencies. Christians were my favorite to belittle. Together, we picked apart the Bible since it had so many inconsistencies. It was like an 85-pound weakling for anyone wanting to flex their scientific muscles. Eventually, I left Wall Street and started photographing homeless people, addicts in the South Bronx. When I first walked into the Bronx, I assumed I would find the same cynicism there that I found in myself, that they had towards faith. If anyone seemed the perfect candidate for atheism, it would be those who experienced continually how unfair, unjust, and evil the world can be. But what I found was that none of them were. Rather, I found some of the most faithful people I'd ever found. They were some of the strongest believers I'd ever met, and they had a faith that didn't judge them. Who was I to tell them their faith was irrational? It was what held them up. Who was I to tell them that the one who gives them hope and offers them a perspective of beauty is irrational? I cannot tell them that there is nothing beyond this physical life. That would feel like a cruel and pointless exercise. Out from behind the computers in the city, I have been reminded that life is not rational and that everyone makes mistakes. Or in biblical terms, we're all sinners. And on the streets, the addicts with their daily battles and proximity to death have come to understand this viscerally. Many successful people never experience weakness. Their sense of entitlement and emotional distance has numbed their understanding of our infallibility. Soon I saw my atheism for what it was, an intellectual belief most accessible to those who had done well in life. What he's saying here is that Jesus has a way of coming along the hurting, the weak, the addicts, and lifting them up and giving them hope. They've made mistakes, and they've gone through some hardships in life, and maybe some of them got into addictions that they can't control. But in the midst of their weakness, they've found something that gives them hope, that holds them up and sustains them in the lowest parts of life. And they aren't really afraid of that. In fact, it helps them. And that's a little bit hard for others to understand, as he says, from his elitist background. It was hard for him to picture. But when he saw God's work and God's love in action, he realized this was real. And it changed everything for him. Because somehow God works through our weaknesses. God comes alongside us when we need him most. There's one more verse I wanted to show you. It's the closing verses, well, two verses, 13 and 14 of chapter 4 of Exodus. It says, "But Moses said, 'Pardon your servant, Lord.'" This is his fifth and final thing he says to God. "But please send someone else." And then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. So not after the first 4 times, but after this time. And Moses at this point doesn't give an excuse. He's just saying flat out, "I don't want to do it. Please send someone else." And it just shows God's great patience, as over and over God addressed his questions, has dealt with him. And finally, when Moses finally admitted his heart, "I just don't want to go," God says, "Well, I'm not done with you." And I think about our verse, God's at work. He is very patient. And that's good news for you and for me, right? That's good news that he's patient with us. I was meeting with somebody this week for lunch, and we were chatting, and I talked about signs. Think of Moses got these 3 signs, right? The staff and the leprosy and the river to blood. And I was thinking, it would sort of be nice. Wouldn't it be nice if sometimes God gave me a sign or something I could see? It'd sure make my job easier. More people would want to come to Christ, and they see God at work and see all these powerful things happen. It's like, it'd be nice if see some more of that, Lord. And as I said this to someone, he said to me, he said, I've come to learn God doesn't usually choose the easy route. And I walked away thinking about that. It's true, isn't it? God doesn't usually give us the easy road, because there's more important things he wants to teach us along the way. And he's going to be patient with us, because we'll make mistakes. And sometimes we'll flat out say, I can't do that, God. And God patiently works with that. He comes along to Moses. In Moses' case, he said, okay, so I'll get your brother, Aaron. He's going to come and help you. And that's finally taking away his last excuse, and said, okay, let's go. And he goes, and you know the rest of the story. But I thought, God has a way of using our weaknesses, doesn't he? Right at the end, there's that question, the last phrase says, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Let me ask you this. Why did God get mad at Moses? Why do you think he didn't get mad at him the first 4, but right at the end he gets mad at him. Why? And I don't think it was because Moses was asking questions or because Moses felt like he didn't have resources. I think those are all honest questions, and God used them to teach him and to learn. But why did God finally get mad at him after this one? And I think it's probably because he revealed that Moses was revealing that he just didn't believe that God could use his weakness, an under-resourced guy, to pull this off. He just couldn't believe that God could use him. So send someone else. Please send someone else, God. And I wonder if we've used that excuse sometimes too. Paul dealt with this, same thing, a writer in the New Testament, and he says that he came to the point where he realized that in his strength, that God takes our weaknesses and he sees that as an opportunity for his strength to be used in our life. And when we view things from that perspective, it kind of takes away the excuses. It's like, God, you can use me. You can use my weakness. And you want to work through me. And I think when we get there, when we have that state of humility, but we don't take it to the extreme where we say, God, you can't use me. But when we understand what God is doing, we realize that God will empower us, and he'll be there for us, and he wants us to depend on him. He wants us to understand that his grace is sufficient. Let's pray. Let's talk to him. Father in heaven, I thank you for this time that we've had together to look into your word. We recognize that you are a great God, and we have so much available to us. But Lord, you want to use us in our weaknesses. You want us to recognize our need for you and our dependency on you. And so we want to declare that this morning and just say, Lord, in our weakness, we allow you to work through us. Help us to be strong. Help us to grow this character that you want to see in our lives. Help us to live in such a way that when people around us see Christians or think of Christians, they think of high character people. Because you are at work and moving and shaping in our lives and motivating us. Despite our sinfulness, despite our problems, God, you are our strength. Thank you for being there for us. Thank you for this example of Moses, who felt he had nothing to offer, and yet you used him powerfully. God, we want to be in that same position. Use us for your glory in building your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.